May 26, 1941, New Orleans, Louisiana. The morning sun beat down on the industrial canal as Commander William F. Wild Bill Eaton stepped onto the weathered dock at Higgins Industries, his polished Navy shoes immediately absorbing dust from the sawmill operations. Behind him, a delegation of senior officers from the Navy's Bureau of Ships and the Marine Corps Equipment Board shifted uncomfortably in the Louisiana heat, their expressions skeptical. 3 days earlier, they had shown Andrew Jackson Higgins their carefully drafted plans for a tank lighter, a specialized landing craft capable of carrying a Sherman tank from ship to shore. They needed engineering drawings, design specifications, technical proposals, standard procurement procedure. Andrew Higgins had laughed in their faces. "The hell with your drawings," he'd said, his Louisiana drawl thick with whiskey and contempt. "You just be here Thursday morning. I'll have your boat." "This is impossible," Eaton thought, as they approached the waterfront. "No one builds a 36-foot landing craft in 72 hours. Not even with a full naval shipyard. Certainly not some backwater lumber baron who builds swamp boats for trappers." Then he saw it. Floating at the dock, still wet with fresh paint, was a flat-bottomed landing craft unlike anything the Navy had designed. 36 feet of welded steel hull, a protected propeller recessed into a tunnel, a bow that— Eaton blinked twice, a bow that had been fitted with a hinged ramp. The ramp sat flush against the bow, secured with heavy pins, ready to drop forward onto a beach. Higgins stood on the dock, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth, his shirt already sweat-stained despite the early hour. "Well," he barked, "you wanted a tank lighter? There's your goddamn tank lighter. Want to see if it works, or you just gonna stand there with your mouths open?" What Commander Eaton and his delegation were witnessing, though none of them fully understood it yet, was the moment World War II's most important weapon was born. Not a fighter plane, not a battleship, not a tank. A simple plywood and steel boat that could run in 10 inches of water, carry 36 fully armed men, or an 8,000-pound vehicle, and deposit them directly onto hostile beaches through a bow ramp that dropped like a drawbridge. This boat would change everything. German military planners had spent 2 years fortifying the major ports of Europe, confident that any invasion required deep water harbors and massive dock facilities. They were about to discover that Andrew Jackson Higgins, a profane, hard-drinking boat builder who allegedly sold vessels to both the Coast Guard chasing bootleggers and the bootleggers themselves during Prohibition, had made their entire defensive strategy obsolete. The journey to this moment had begun not in Navy shipyards or military planning offices, but in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, where an unconventional businessman built boats for people who needed to move through shallow water quickly and quietly. Now, standing on that dock in May 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, the weapon that President Dwight D. Eisenhower would later credit with winning World War II was about to take its first test. The story of Andrew Jackson Higgins began far from the battlefields of World War II. Born in Columbus, Nebraska in 1886, Higgins had drifted to New Orleans in the 1920s, drawn by the timber business and the opportunities of a city where law enforcement was negotiable and entrepreneurship was measured in audacity rather than credentials. He founded Higgins Industries in 1930, manufacturing boats for oil companies, trappers, and rum runners, though he would always deny the latter with a grin that suggested otherwise. His specialty was the Eureka boat, designed in 1926 for Louisiana's oil industry. The Eureka featured a revolutionary flat-bottomed, shallow-draft design with a protected propeller that allowed it to navigate through bayous and swamps where traditional boats would ground out or snag their props on cypress knees and underwater debris. The boat could reverse off sandbars without damage. It could operate in water shallow enough to walk through, and it was fast. Powered by a 225-horsepower gray marine diesel engine, it could hit 12 knots in channels where other boats struggled to maintain 5. The Marine Corps began paying attention to Higgins in 1938. Their problem was brutally simple. The United States had no viable method for amphibious assault. The Marine Corps' experimental landing craft were slow, cumbersome vessels that required proper docks or piers. They couldn't approach a defended beach. They couldn't reverse off after unloading. And they required soldiers to clamber over the sides, exposed to enemy fire, often into water over their heads. But it was a young Marine lieutenant named Victor Harold Krulak who provided the crucial insight. In 1937, Krulak had been stationed in Shanghai, observing Japanese military operations. On November 12, 1937, he watched Japanese forces conduct an amphibious assault on Chinese positions near Hangzhou Bay. The Japanese boats, designed by naval architect Asanosuke Watanabe, featured a bow ramp that dropped forward, allowing troops to charge directly onto the beach rather than climbing over the sides. Krulak took photographs. He made detailed sketches. He wrote reports that found their way to Marine Corps headquarters and eventually to the Bureau of Ships. The concept was simple but revolutionary. A hinged bow ramp that would drop onto the beach, creating a bridge from boat to shore. Troops could disembark in seconds rather than minutes. They could maintain formation. They could bring vehicles. The Navy's Bureau of Ships began designing their version. It was complex, heavy, and expensive. They scheduled production for 1943. Andrew Higgins had other ideas. When Marine Corps officers visited his New Orleans facility in 1939, inspecting his Eureka boats for potential military use, Higgins listened to their requirements and immediately understood the solution. "You need a ramp," he said. "I can build you a boat with a ramp." The Navy brass dismissed him. Their engineers knew better. Landing craft required sophisticated naval architecture, not some Louisiana boat builder's intuition. They continued with their own designs. The Bureau-designed landing craft were heavily built, slow, and required specialized steel components that would strain wartime production. For 2 years, Higgins fought the Navy's procurement bureaucracy. His Eureka boats, now designated as LCP, landing craft personnel, were purchased in limited numbers, but they lacked the crucial bow ramp. Marines still had to climb over the sides under fire. Higgins kept pushing for the ramp design, but the Bureau of Ships blocked him at every turn. Then came that morning in May 1941. The Navy delegation arrived with their tank lighter specifications, expecting proposals and paperwork. Instead, Higgins made his 72-hour promise. His workers at Higgins Industries worked around the clock. Welders, ship fitters, diesel mechanics, all pulled from other projects. They fabricated the steel hull. They installed the gray marine diesel. They engineered the bow ramp mechanism, a heavy steel ramp that could be raised and lowered by hand-operated windlasses, secured with heavy pins during transit, and dropped onto the beach in seconds. 72 hours later, Commander Eaton and his delegation watched as Higgins himself piloted the prototype across Lake Pontchartrain, ran at full speed onto a beach, dropped the ramp, loaded a truck, reversed off without difficulty, ran to another beach, and did it again. The Navy officers took turns piloting it. They ran it onto sandbars. They tested the reverse capability. They checked the protected propeller tunnel that prevented damage from sand and coral. It worked flawlessly. By June 1941, the Bureau of Ships grudgingly approved Higgins' design for production. They designated it the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, Andrew Higgins filed his patent application for the ramped bow design. U.S. Patent number 2341866 was issued on February 15, 1944, but by then, thousands of Higgins boats were already in production. The specifications were deceptively simple: 36 feet long, 10 feet 10 inches beam, displacing 18,000 pounds fully loaded. The hull was constructed of plywood over a wooden frame. mahogany marine plywood that was both lightweight and surprisingly durable. The sides were protected by steel plates forward. The bow ramp was heavy, welded steel. The 225 horsepower gray marine diesel engine, mounted amidships, gave it a top speed of 12 knots, roughly 14 miles per hour. The protected propeller tunnel allowed operation in water as shallow as 10 inches. Capacity: 36 fully armed combat troops with equipment, or 1 jeep, and 12 troops, or 1 8,000-pound vehicle. The crew consisted of 3 Navy sailors, coxswain, engineer, and bowman. Production began in earnest in 1942. Higgins Industries expanded rapidly, taking over warehouses, converting facilities, hiring workers at a ferocious pace. By 1943, Higgins employed over 30,000 workers in New Orleans, and, in an uncommon practice for the time, his workforce included both black workers and women working alongside white men at equal pay for equal work. Giant banners hung over the factory floors. "The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis." Andrew Higgins himself became legendary. He cursed like a longshoreman. He drank whiskey openly in the office. He fought with Navy procurement officers, insulted admirals, and once told a congressional delegation that government red tape was stupider than a box of rocks. His profanity, one observer noted, flows as naturally as water from a spring. He operated, another said, in a big way and didn't give a damn about money. But he built boats like no one else in America. The Higgins boat's combat debut came on August 7, 1942, at Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, conducted the first major American amphibious assault of the Pacific War. At 0909 hours, the first wave of Higgins boats hit Red Beach. The bow ramps dropped, Marines charged ashore. Within minutes, hundreds of troops had landed with minimal casualties from the landing itself. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. Tarawa, November 20, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division carried assault troops across the reef at Batillo Island. Kwajalein, February 1, 1944, the 4th Marine Division landed 15,000 troops in the first day using Higgins boats and their larger cousin, the LCM tank lighters. Saipan, June 15, 1944, 8,000 Marines landed in the first 20 minutes. Paleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The names became synonymous with amphibious assault, and at each island, Higgins boats delivered the first waves. In the European theater, the pattern was identical. Operation Torch, November 8, 1942, saw American troops landing on the beaches of North Africa in Higgins boats. Sicily, July 10, 1943, multiple divisions landed simultaneously across dozens of beaches. Anzio, January 22, 1944. The surprise landing that outflanked German positions was possible only because Higgins boats allowed troops to land on previously inaccessible beaches. Operation Dragoon, August 15, 1944. The invasion of southern France involved hundreds of Higgins boats landing 7 divisions in the first day. The German High Command watched these operations with growing alarm. Their entire coastal defense strategy had been predicated on a simple assumption: amphibious invasions required capturing deep-water ports. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais. These were the obvious targets, and Germany had fortified them accordingly. The prospect of landing tens of thousands of troops with their vehicles, artillery, and supplies directly onto open beaches seemed logistically impossible. The Higgins boat made it routine. Allied planning officers could now look at any stretch of coastline and ask simply, is the gradient manageable? Can boats approach without grounding on reefs? If yes, then that beach was a potential invasion site. This single fact transformed the strategic calculus of the war. Instead of defending a dozen ports, Germany now had to defend thousands of miles of coastline. every beach became a potential vulnerability. The Wehrmacht commanders spread their forces thinner and thinner, trying to cover every possible landing site. They built obstacles, steel hedgehogs, concrete tetrahedrons, wooden stakes designed to stop landing craft. But Higgins boats, with their shallow draft and protected propellers, could navigate between obstacles, hit the beach, drop their ramps, and reverse off before coming under effective fire. Marine Corps Colonel Joseph H. Alexander later wrote, "The Higgins boat broke the ship-to-shore gridlock." Before the LCVP, amphibious assault was a tactical curiosity. After the LCVP, it became the dominant form of power projection for the remainder of the war. By early 1944, Higgins Industries was producing boats at an extraordinary rate. The company had expanded to 7 major facilities in New Orleans. Production lines ran 24 hours a day. At peak production in 1943, Higgins Industries completed 1 LCVP every 17 hours. The boats came off the line, were tested in Lake Pontchartrain, and shipped to staging areas across the world. And then came June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and cold over the English Channel on June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was the largest amphibious assault in human history. 5 divisions would land simultaneously across 50 miles of French coastline. The first wave alone involved over 150,000 troops, and nearly all of them would ride Higgins boats to shore. 1,500 Higgins boats participated in D-Day. They hung from davits on transport ships scattered across the channel. At 0200 hours, sailors began lowering them into rough seas. Soldiers climbed down cargo nets in darkness, timing their jumps to match the boat's rise and fall in 6-foot swells. Engines coughed to life. Coxswains checked their compasses and synchronized watches. Utah Beach, 0628 hours. The first Higgins boats hit the sand. Bow ramps dropped. 4th Infantry Division troops charged forward into light resistance. They had landed slightly off target, but the Higgins boat's ability to land anywhere meant this wasn't the disaster it would have been with conventional landing craft requiring specific dock facilities. Omaha Beach, 0630 hours. The situation was catastrophically different. German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division occupied bunkers and trenches overlooking the beach. When the bow ramps of the first Higgins boats dropped, machine gun fire swept the ramps. Soldiers fell in the surf. Boats took direct hits from 88mm guns. Coxswains maneuvered desperately, trying to find cover, but the beach offered none. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, Company B, 116th Infantry Regiment, rode LCVP A-22-20 toward Omaha Beach in the first wave. Years later, he described the final approach. About 150 yards from shore, we encountered artillery fire. Shells landed on both sides of our craft. The ramp was lowered, and the boat immediately took a hit. Water rushed in. Bodies floated around me. I made it to shore, but half our boat never did. The carnage at Omaha Beach was not a failure of the Higgins boat design. It was a testament to German defensive positions and the failure of pre-invasion bombardment to neutralize them. But the Higgins boat's very design provided what salvation was possible. Boats could reverse off the beach after unloading, return to transports for more troops, and make multiple runs. Coxswains showed extraordinary courage, running boats back to the beach again and again under fire. By day's end, despite staggering casualties at Omaha, the beaches were secure. Allied forces had landed 156,000 troops. Higgins boats had delivered them. German commanders were stunned. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for coastal defenses, had predicted that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea if they could even manage to land at all. He had fortified the major ports. He had built obstacles. He had positioned his strongest divisions to respond to attacks on Calais or Cherbourg. Instead, the Americans and British had landed everywhere at once, on open beaches, using boats that could operate in shallow water and navigate through obstacles. Rommel's famous Atlantic Wall had been bypassed entirely. The Allies didn't need to capture a port, they had their own beaches. Adolf Hitler himself, in his bunker in Berchtesgaden, received reports of the Normandy landings with disbelief that turned to grudging respect. The Führer, who fancied himself a military genius, recognized immediately the tactical revolution he was witnessing. The Americans had solved the amphibious assault problem not through superior firepower or better soldiers, but through superior engineering, a simple boat that could land anywhere. The strategic implications were staggering. In the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur's island hopping campaign relied entirely on Higgins boats. Each invasion bypassed heavily defended positions, landing instead on lightly defended beaches. The Japanese, like the Germans, had fortified ports and major landing areas. The Higgins boat made those fortifications irrelevant. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific forces, later stated, "Without the Higgins boat, we could not have conducted island warfare. We would have been forced to assault fortified positions directly. Casualties would have been unsustainable." The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. Traditional amphibious assault, landing at docks, capturing ports, bringing in troops through established facilities, required enormous force concentration and accepted massive casualties at choke points. The Higgins boat distributed risk across hundreds of landing sites simultaneously. It turned the defenders' advantage into a fatal liability. Spread too thin across too many miles, German and Japanese forces could not concentrate overwhelming force anywhere. By late 1944, the pattern was established across both theaters. Operation Dragoon in southern France, August 15, 1944, landed 7 divisions in a single day. Peleliu, September 15, 1944, delivered 30,000 Marines in the first week. Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945, saw 70,000 Marines land over 4 days. Okinawa, April 1, 1945, involved the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, 182,000 troops in the first 2 weeks, nearly all delivered by Higgins boats. Each landing demonstrated the same principle. The Higgins boat had made amphibious assault practical, repeatable, and, relatively, survivable. Not safe, thousands died on the beaches, but possible in a way that had never existed before 1942. The genius of Andrew Higgins' design lay not in complexity, but in ruthless simplification. Every element served a specific purpose, and every unnecessary component had been eliminated. The hull was flat-bottomed, not because it was easier to build, but because flat bottoms drew minimal water and distributed weight evenly, preventing boats from digging into sand when they grounded. The sides were vertical rather than curved, not for aesthetics, but because vertical sides maximized interior volume while maintaining shallow draft. The bow was squared off, not because Higgins couldn't afford a proper pointed bow, but because a squared bow provided a stable platform for the ramp mechanism. The protected propeller was perhaps the most crucial innovation. Traditional boat propellers extend below the hull, vulnerable to damage from sandbars, coral, or debris. Higgins recessed the propeller into a tunnel within the hull. The propeller remained protected, never touching the bottom even when the boat grounded. This meant Higgins boats could hit beaches at full speed, discharge troops, and reverse off without worrying about propeller damage. Coxswains could make multiple runs without needing repairs, a capability that proved vital at Omaha Beach when boats made 4, 5, 6 runs under fire. The bow ramp mechanism was elegantly simple. 2 steel ramps, each hinged at the bottom, secured at the top with heavy pins operated by the bowman. When approaching shore, the bowman pulled the pins. The ramp's own weight brought it crashing down onto the beach. no hydraulics, no motors, no complex machinery to fail under fire or in salt water, gravity and steel. The construction materials reflected wartime realities. Higgins Industries built LCVP hulls from marine plywood, specifically mahogany plywood with waterproof glue. This was not a cost-cutting measure. Plywood was actually more expensive than steel plate. But plywood construction was faster, required less skilled labor, and didn't require steel that was needed for tanks, ships, and aircraft. Higgins could hire furniture makers and train them to build boats in weeks. Steel shipbuilding required years of apprenticeship. The sides and bow ramp were steel, armor plate forward to protect troops from small arms fire during the final approach, but the hull remained wood. This combination of materials, wood for buoyancy and speed of construction, steel for protection, exemplified Higgins' pragmatic engineering philosophy. The gray marine diesel engine was standard across thousands of boats. This standardization meant mechanics at any port could service any LCVP. Spare parts were interchangeable. Training was simplified. Compare this to German landing craft, multiple engine types, different manufacturers, incompatible parts, each requiring specialized maintenance crews. The Americans chose efficiency over perfection. Andrew Higgins made these choices deliberately, often over Navy objections. Bureau of Ships engineers wanted steel hulls, stronger, more durable, more proper. Higgins ignored them and built plywood boats that worked perfectly for their intended lifespan. Navy planners wanted enclosed cabins for crew protection. Higgins refused. Enclosed spaces would fill with water if the boat was hit, and open designs let wounded be evacuated quickly. Navy procurement wanted standardized colors and finishes. Higgins painted boats whatever color was available and told inspectors to mind their own business. His design philosophy was simple: build boats that work, build them fast, build them cheap enough to lose in combat, and don't waste time on refinements that don't contribute to the mission. A Higgins boat didn't need to be beautiful. It needed to get 36 men from ship to shore alive. And it did, again and again, across 2 oceans and 4 years of war. The scale of Higgins boat production was staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, Higgins Industries produced 23,358 LCVPs. But that number only tells part of the story. Higgins Industries also built the larger LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized, LCM-3s, capable of carrying a Sherman tank. They built PT boats for the Navy. They built supply boats, patrol boats, and pontoon barges. In total, Higgins Industries produced over 20,000 landing craft of various types. By 1943, an astonishing statistic emerged. 9 out of every 10 vessels in the United States Navy were Higgins-designed boats. Not ships. The battleships, carriers, and cruisers came from major shipyards. But vessels, the small craft that did the unglamorous work of moving men and material from ship to shore. The Navy had become, in effect, dependent on one hard-drinking boat builder from Louisiana. The human cost and salvation provided by these boats is harder to quantify, but no less significant. At Tarawa, November 20th to 23rd, 1943, Higgins boats delivered Marines directly to the beach when reef conditions prevented the larger Amtraks from approaching. Casualties were horrific, over 1,000 Marines killed in 3 days, but military historians agree that without Higgins boats making continuous resupply runs, the assault would have failed entirely. At Anzio, January 22, 1944, the surprise achieved by landing 36,000 troops on beaches the Germans considered impossible to assault gave Allies a crucial foothold in Italy. VI Corps Commander Major General John P. Lucas later wrote, "We put 2 divisions ashore without the Germans realizing it until we were already established. That's not possible with conventional landing craft requiring port facilities." At Normandy, despite the carnage at Omaha Beach, the Higgins boat's ability to make multiple runs saved the operation. Many coxswains made 6 or 7 trips to the beach on June 6, 1944, each time returning to transport ships for more troops, ammunition, or wounded. Petty Officer Kenneth Romsberg, coxswain of LCVP PA 31-12, made 8 trips to Omaha Beach. He received the Bronze Star for his actions, though he later said, "I was just doing my job. The boat did the work. I just steered." In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign's speed depended entirely on Higgins boats. Traditional amphibious doctrine suggested months between major operations. MacArthur's forces conducted major landings sometimes weeks apart. The logistics were simplified by one fact: every beach was potentially usable. Higgins boats meant invasion planners could choose landing sites based on tactical advantage rather than being constrained by geography. The Higgins boat also enabled casualties to be evacuated faster. After delivering troops to shore, boats would load wounded for the return trip. This reduced the time from injury to medical treatment, critical for survival. At Okinawa, the 10th Army established floating aid stations offshore. Higgins boats shuttled wounded from beach to aid station to hospital ship in continuous cycles. But Higgins boats died too. At Omaha Beach, dozens were destroyed by German artillery. At Tarawa, Japanese defenders targeted landing craft with 75mm guns. At Iwo Jima, rough seas swamped boats, drowning soldiers before they ever reached shore. At Okinawa, kamikaze aircraft targeted landing craft, and several Higgins boats were sunk by direct hits. Coxswains who piloted these boats showed remarkable courage. These were not hardened Marines or Army infantry. They were Navy sailors, many barely out of their teens, trained for months rather than years, thrust into combat situations where split-second decisions meant life or death for 36 soldiers who depended on them. They navigated by compass in pre-dawn darkness. They timed approaches to match artillery barrages. They dodged obstacles and incoming fire. And when the ramp dropped, they held position under fire while troops disembarked, then reversed off and did it again. Navy records show that over 1,000 Higgins boats were destroyed in combat. Coxswain casualty rates were proportionally higher than the troops they carried. Exposed in the stern, steering the boat, unable to take cover, they were vulnerable to the final seconds of approach when enemy fire was most intense. Yet they kept coming, wave after wave, beach after beach. From Guadalcanal in August 1942 to Okinawa in April 1945, Higgins boats delivered Allied forces to hostile shores. The pattern never varied. Engines roaring, bow ramps dropping, soldiers charging forward, boats reversing off to fetch more. The production statistics of Higgins Industries during World War II remain almost incomprehensible in scale. The 23,358 LCVPs were complemented by thousands of other craft. LCM-3, Landing Craft Mechanized Mark III, 8,631 built, 50 feet long, capable of carrying 1 Sherman tank or 60 troops. These were the boats that delivered armor to beaches. LCM-6, 2,718 built, an improved version with more powerful engines and better seaworthiness. PT boats, 199 built, the famed patrol torpedo boats, immortalized by John F. Kennedy's PT-109. Supply vessels, pontoon barges, patrol boats, thousands more, exact numbers disputed by sources. In total, Higgins Industries employed over 30,000 workers at peak production. The company operated 7 major facilities in New Orleans. Andrew Higgins personally walked the factory floors daily, cigar in mouth, cursing at anyone who wasn't working fast enough, praising those who showed initiative. He paid well, often above union scale, and famously hired workers other companies wouldn't: African Americans, women, anyone who could swing a hammer or run a welding torch. His integrated workforce was scandalous in 1940s New Orleans, but Higgins didn't care. "I don't care if you're black, white, or polka-dotted. Can you build boats? Then get to work." The cost per LCVP in 1944 dollars was approximately $12,000, roughly $180,000 in 2024 dollars. This was astonishingly cheap for a military vessel. By comparison, a single Sherman tank cost $44,000 and a P-51 Mustang cost $51,000. The Higgins boat's low cost meant it could be treated as expendable. If a boat was damaged beyond immediate repair, it was abandoned. New boats could be brought forward from the continuous production lines. But the true cost was human. While casualty figures specifically for Higgins boat crews are incomplete, Navy records indicate that of the thousands of coxswains, engineers, and bowmen who served on LCVPs, hundreds died in combat. They drowned when boats swamped. They were killed by artillery fire during approaches. They died when boats hit mines. Their names appear in Navy casualty lists, but their specific stories are often lost, overshadowed by the infantry regiments they supported. The boats themselves fared little better. Of the 23,358 LCVPs built, fewer than 20 are known to survive today. Most were destroyed in combat or scrapped after the war. A few were sold surplus and converted to civilian use: fishing boats, ferries, workboats. Time, saltwater, and neglect claimed most of those. One surviving Higgins boat, LCVP PA-33-21, sits in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The museum Andrew Higgins never lived to see, having died in 1952, his fortune spent, his company dissolved, his boats scattered across the world or rotting in scrapyards. The strategic impact, however, is permanent. After World War II, every major military recognized that amphibious assault capability was essential. The United States Marine Corps built its entire post-war doctrine around it. The Soviet Union developed their own landing craft based on captured Higgins boats. Britain continued using modified LCVPs for decades. Modern landing craft, LCU, LCAC, and others are direct descendants of Higgins' design principles: shallow draft, protected propulsion, bow ramps, simple construction. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1964 interview with historian Stephen Ambrose provided the most succinct judgment. Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. May 26, 1941. Commander Eaton, standing on that New Orleans dock, watching Andrew Higgins pilot his prototype landing craft, represented a turning point not just in naval warfare, but in American military philosophy. The United States would win World War II not through superior tactics or better soldiers, though both helped, but through industrial might applied to practical problems. The Higgins boat embodied this approach. It wasn't sophisticated, it wasn't beautiful. German and Japanese engineers would have considered it crude: plywood hulls, exposed crews, minimal armament, no grace in the design. But it worked. It worked reliably, repeatedly, and at a scale that overwhelmed enemy defenses. By war's end, Higgins boats had participated in every major amphibious operation: North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, Normandy, southern France, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They had landed millions of troops. They had delivered thousands of vehicles. They had changed the strategic calculus of warfare by making the previously impossible, landing armies directly onto hostile beaches, routine. The supreme irony remained: the weapon that won World War II, according to the Supreme Allied Commander, was designed by a boat builder who started his career allegedly selling boats to bootleggers, a man who cursed at admirals, ignored Navy regulations, hired workers the establishment rejected, and built boats his own way, regardless of what the Bureau of Ships demanded. A man who, when told something was impossible, responded, "The hell it can't be done," and then proved it. Andrew Higgins died in 1952, age 65, broke. His company had collapsed after the war when Navy contracts evaporated. The boats that had won the war became surplus, sold for scrap. Higgins himself died in relative obscurity, remembered in New Orleans but largely forgotten nationally. Yet his boats changed history. German coastal defenses had been built on an assumption: invasions require ports that Higgins' design made obsolete. Japanese island fortifications had been positioned assuming Allies would need to capture specific landing areas, but Higgins' boats could land anywhere. Every calculation, every defensive plan, every strategic assessment made by Axis powers before 1942 was invalidated by a 36-foot plywood boat with a drop-down ramp. The Higgins boat proved that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from the centers of power, but from the margins. Not from naval architects in established shipyards, but from an entrepreneur in Louisiana who built swamp boats. Not from years of careful planning, but from a 72-hour crash program where impossible was answered with profanity and determination. Today, amphibious assault capability remains fundamental to military power. Modern landing craft are faster, larger, more sophisticated. But they still follow Higgins' principles: shallow draft, protected propulsion, bow ramps, simple enough to mass produce. The United States Marine Corps, the world's premier amphibious force, exists because Andrew Higgins designed a boat that could run in 10 inches of water and drop troops directly onto beaches. Fewer than 20 Higgins boats survive. The one in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans sits silent, its engine cold, its plywood hull preserved behind barriers. Visitors can see it but not touch it, can imagine but not experience the terror of riding it toward a hostile shore. The boat sits as monument and testament. This simple craft, repeated 23,000 times, carried democracy back to occupied Europe and across the Pacific. It made victory possible. And it was built by a man who, when Navy bureaucrats said it couldn't be done, responded with a cigar, a curse, and a working prototype. Eisenhower was right. The Higgins boat won the war, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was simple, practical, and built by someone who didn't follow the rules. Sometimes that's exactly what victory requires.